Agency letter arrived on a Tuesday, and Gideon Voss read it twice before he crumpled it in his fist and threw it into the wood stove. It wasn't the words that made his stomach turn. It was the smiling face of Mr. Harold Fenwick, the agency director who had written them, that Gideon could picture clearly: round cheeks, wire spectacles, soft hands that had never once pulled a calf out of frozen mud. The letter was polite, professional. It explained with the careful language of a man who charged $15 hour per placement that a clerical error had occurred, that the widow Mrs. Clara Whitmore had been matched to the Voss ranch under the wrong file, that she had been led to believe she was arriving for a marital arrangement, not a housekeeping position. The agency accepted no liability for emotional distress caused by miscommunication between parties. No liability. 4 children had been brought across 3 states on the promise of a home. A woman had packed every remaining piece of her life into 2 worn bags and boarded a train in January, and Harold Fenwick accepted no liability. Gideon stood at the stove and watched the letter burn. If you've ever had to make a decision, you weren't ready for one that landed on your doorstep without warning and demanded an answer before you had time to think, then you already understand something about Gideon Voss. And if you've ever been the person standing on the cold side of that door, waiting to find out whether someone was going to open it or turn you away, then you understand something about Clara. This is a story about a mistake that became a family. About 2 people who didn't want each other and ended up being exactly what the other needed. About 4 boys who arrived as an inconvenience and became the reason a man remembered how to care about something again. If you're new here, we'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel. Before we begin, hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. These stories have traveled farther than we ever expected, and we love seeing just how far. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The Cheyenne station in January was not a place that invited lingering. Platform boards were glazed with ice from the night before, and the wind came off the open plain with the kind of patience that only cold wind has steady and indifferent is prepared to wait you out. The 11:40 from Laramie arrived 12 minutes late. It wasn't remarkable, but the way it exhaled steam into the gray morning air made it look like even the locomotive was exhausted. Gideon Voss stood at the far end of the platform, with his collar turned up and his hat pulled low. He was 41 years old, though he looked closer to 46, not because he had aged badly, but because the last 4 years had been the kind that left marks. His jaw carried 2 days of growth he hadn't bothered to address. His boots were clean but cracked along the left toe. He held a piece of paper in his gloved hand, the name the agency had telegraphed: Mrs. Clara W. Housekeeping. Train 11:40. He had hired a housekeeper before. Once, 3 years back, a stout woman named Mrs. Adler, who had lasted 8 months before deciding the isolation was more than she'd bargained for. He didn't blame her. The Voss Ranch sat 11 miles outside of Cheyenne, and in winter those 11 miles had a way of feeling like 100. What he needed was someone practical, someone who wouldn't flinch at hard work, someone who understood that a ranch wasn't a hotel and that he wasn't running a social institution. What stepped off the train was not what he had mentally prepared for. She came down the steps carefully, not timidly, but with the measured movement of someone managing more than her own weight. In her left hand, she carried a large bag that pulled at her shoulder. In her right, she held the hand of a small boy, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, who descended each step with both feet before attempting the next. Behind her came 3 more boys in a staggered line, a teenager moving with the studied casualness of someone trying to look unbothered, a boy of maybe 10 who was watching everything around him with quiet, assessing eyes, and another, somewhere between the two, was pulling at the strap of a canvas bag with the focus of someone who had learned not to let things slip out of his. Gideon counted them once, then again. 4. He folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket. The woman reached the platform and set her bag down for a moment, straightening her back with a small movement that suggested it had been carrying weight for longer than this train ride. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair pinned back under a gray wool hat that had seen better winters. Her coat was adequate, not warm enough. Her face was one of those faces that looked like it had decided somewhere along the way to stop apologizing for things it couldn't change. She was scanning the platform. He didn't move yet. He wasn't sure why. He watched her look at the other men standing near the depot doors, assess them, dismiss them. Then her eyes found him standing alone at the far end, holding very still, and something in her expression shifted. Not relief, more like recognition of an obstacle she had been expecting. She picked up her bag and walked toward him, and the four boys fell into formation behind her without being told, which told Gideon something about how long they'd been doing this. "Mr. Voss," she said. "Not a question, Mrs. Whitmore." He looked at the boys, then back at her. "The agency said one." "The agency said a great many things," she replied, and her voice was level in a way that took some effort. Most of them were not accurate. He looked at the youngest, who was now pressed against his mother's legs and staring up at Gideon with enormous brown eyes and a runny nose that nobody had addressed yet. "How many of those are yours?" She looked at him with an expression that he would only later recognize as the particular look a person gives when they're deciding whether to answer a stupid question with patience or with honesty. "All four," she said. The teenager behind her made a small sound that might have been a laugh, suppressed badly. The one with the assessing eyes did not look away from Gideon's face. Gideon stood there for a moment in the cold and thought about Harold Fenwick and his wire spectacles and his letter about liability. Then he looked at the woman in front of him and the four children behind her and the ice on the platform boards and the sky that was already suggesting it had more weather to offer before dark. "My wagon's on the south side," he said, and turned and walked. The ride out to the ranch took an hour and 40 minutes in good conditions. That day it took closer to 2 hours, because a section of the creek road had softened under a melt and refreeze cycle, and Gideon had to navigate the wagon around it, through a stretch of scrub that the horses objected to loudly. Nobody spoke much during the first hour. The three older boys sat in the wagon bed with the bags. The youngest, Noah, he would learn later, fell asleep against his mother's arm within 15 minutes, which said something about how long the child had been running on too little sleep. Clara sat on the bench beside Gideon and looked at the land with the expression of someone taking inventory rather than admiring scenery. "How many head?" she asked. "Somewhere around the 30-minute mark." He glanced at her. "What? Cattle. How many head are you running?" "About 60. Down from 90 before last winter." She absorbed this. "Hard winter?" "Hard enough." Another 10 minutes passed. The agency letter said housekeeper. Gideon said, "Yes, you were expecting something different." She didn't answer right away. The wagon hit a rut, and she steadied the sleeping child against her without breaking the motion. "I was told the position was a formal arrangement," she said finally. "That a widower with a ranch was seeking a woman to manage the household with the understanding of a more permanent arrangement. That's not what I asked for." "No," she said. "I'm aware of that now." He let that sit. "Where's their father?" he asked. "Fever. 18 months ago." She said it the same way she said everything straightforward. No decoration, no invitation for sympathy. "We were in Missouri. His family didn't want us after. Mine was gone before that. The agency offered placement for widows with children, so I applied. And they sent you here. They sent me here, thinking I knew what I was walking into." She adjusted Noah on her arm. "I didn't. But I don't imagine that changes your situation any." Gideon drove and thought about that. He had not planned for this. He had planned for someone to arrive, learn the household rhythms, manage the cooking and cleaning and supply inventory through the winter months, and leave him free to focus on the herd and the outbuildings and the 17 things on his repair list that had been sitting there since October. He had not planned for 4 children and a woman who spoke to him like she was under no obligation to make him comfortable. When the ranch came into view, The main house, with its dark timber frame, the barn off to the east, the smaller outbuilding that served as a tool store, and sometimes a sick bay for injured animals. He watched her look at it. She didn't say it was smaller than she expected. She didn't say anything at all. But he saw her take in the sagging gutter on the north side of the house, the woodpile that was adequate, but not generous, the gate that was hanging at a slight angle from a hinge that hadn't been properly reset. She was cataloging, not criticizing. He could feel the difference. The wagon stopped. The boys came alive in the back. The teenagers swung down before the wheels had fully settled, and Gideon said, "Careful," not because it was particularly dangerous, but because the ground near the barn was frozen unevenly, and he didn't need anyone twisting an ankle in the first 5 minutes. The boy stopped and looked at him. He was perhaps 16, tall for it, with his mother's coloring but something harder in his expression. The wariness of a boy who had been the man of the family for long enough that being told to be careful by an actual man felt like a territorial intrusion. "I'm Ethan," he said, because apparently the thing to do when you arrived at a stranger's ranch in January with nowhere to go was to establish your name. "I know," Gideon said. He didn't, but it seemed like the right answer. He climbed down and went to deal with the horses. First night was not a disaster, which was the best that could be said for it. Clara found the kitchen with the self-sufficiency of someone who had never expected anyone to give her a tour. Pantry was organized in the way a man living alone organized things functional but not logical, with the coffee beans on the highest shelf and the salt on the lowest and no clear principle governing the middle. She didn't comment on this. She found what she needed and had something on the stove inside of 40 minutes. Gideon came in from the barn to find the kitchen smelling like something that wasn't just boiled coffee for the first time in months. He stood in the doorway longer than he needed to. The boys were at the table, not talking loudly, not fighting. The oldest, Ethan, was watching Gideon in the way that teenage boys watch men. They've decided they haven't decided about yet. The middle one, Caleb, was sitting very still and listening to something that wasn't in the room. The one who'd been wrestling with the bag strap all day, Miles, he'd gathered, had found a loose nail in the table and was working at it with his thumbnail. And Noah had woken from his nap and was sitting in a chair with his feet not quite reaching the floor, watching the stove as though he'd been asked to report on it. "Sit down," Clara said to Gideon without turning from the pot. He sat. It was the strangest thing, sitting at his own table and being told to sit at his own table. He wasn't sure if he was annoyed or not. He thought about it and decided it would take more energy than it was worth. She served without ceremony. The food was plain. She'd worked with what was there, but it was hot, and there was enough of it, and nobody at that table had been expecting anything more than survival. So plain and hot and sufficient was a kind of grace. Nobody said much through the meal. The clock on the shelf counted the seconds out loud, the way it always did, and the wind pressed against the north window, the way it always did, and the fire worked at the logs without complaint. There were 6 people in the kitchen instead of 1, and the room had a different quality to it, not comfortable, not yet, but not entirely empty either. After, when she was washing the dishes and the boys had gone to the room, he'd indicated at the top of the 2 beds between 4 of them, which she'd looked at and said nothing. About Gideon poured himself coffee and stood near the stove. "I didn't ask for this," he said. "I know that. I don't know what to do with 4 boys." "You don't have to do anything with them," she said. "They're mine. I'll manage them. And the arrangement." She turned then and looked at him across the kitchen, with the dishcloth in her hands, and her face doing that thing where it was not going to apologize for existing. "I'll work for fair wages through the winter. If the spring makes more sense somewhere else, I'll go. If not," she paused. "We'll talk about it." "That's not a plan." "No," she agreed. "But it's the only honest thing I can offer you right now." He thought that over for a long time. Outside, the wind pushed at the house. The fire talked to itself in the stove. "There's a second room on the north side," he finally said. "Wood floor, small stove. Not heated right now. I'll get it going tomorrow." She nodded. "Just once. Thank you." He finished his coffee and set the cup in the drain and went to bed. In the dark of his room, he stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of other people in his house, the small movements, the settling of weight on unfamiliar floorboards, the muffled voice of a child asking something, and a mother answering too quietly to hear. He had not heard those sounds in 4 years. He had not realized how loud silence was until something interrupted it. He did not sleep well, but he slept. The morning came the way. Wyoming mornings came in January with zero interest in whether you were ready for it. Gideon was in the barn before first light, as he always was. He fed the horses, checked the water trough frozen at the edges, manageable, and worked through the first tier of morning tasks with the automatic efficiency of a man who had done them alone for long enough that he no longer had to think about the sequence. When he came back to the house an hour later, the kitchen was lit and Clara was already at the stove, and the smell of actual biscuits was coming from somewhere that smelled like the oven. Stopped inside the door. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said. "Sit." He sat. Caleb came down the stairs quietly and took a chair across from him without speaking. He had the kind of face that was always listening for something, and he sat with his elbows on the table and looked at Gideon with the straightforward appraisal of a child who had not yet learned that sustained eye contact made adults nervous. "Your roof is bent on the left side," Caleb said. Gideon looked at him. "Pardon?" "The roof. There's a section on the left side above the big window where the shingles are going wrong. If you get heavy snow that stays, it'll come through." Gideon thought about this. The boy was right. He'd noticed the shingle line in November and added it to the list, which had 17 items and was not getting shorter. "How old are you?" Gideon asked. 10, Caleb says. "You know about roofs at 10? Caleb shrugged. "I know about things that are broken." Clara set a plate down between them and didn't comment on the conversation. It was the first time since the wagon ride the night before that Gideon had felt something in the room that wasn't negotiation or tension. Couldn't name it yet. He didn't try. But he added the roof to the top of the list, and when Miles came down 20 minutes later with the same quiet, watchful energy as his brother, and Ethan appeared shortly after looking like he'd slept in his clothes and hadn't decided whether he was going to pretend that was intentional, and Noah came down last, holding a corner of a blanket he'd apparently carried from the room without noticing, when all of them were at his table in his kitchen, filling up the space that had been empty for 4 years. Gideon looked down at his plate and said nothing. He ate, and outsides, the Wyoming wind kept moving across the flat land, indifferent, as it always was, carrying the kind of cold that didn't ask for your opinion. But inside the kitchen, something that wasn't warmth yet but was on its way toward, it was beginning, quietly and without ceremony, to find its place. The second morning on the Voss ranch was colder than the first, and that was saying something. Gideon discovered this when he pushed open the barn door at 5:15 and found that the water barrel inside had developed a skin of ice overnight, despite the fact that it was sitting 6 feet from the old iron heating pipe he'd rigged to, winters ago specifically to prevent that from happening. The pipe had cracked. Not badly, a hairline split near the elbow joint, but enough to let the heat bleed out through the night. And now he was standing in the dark with a lantern in one hand, and the particular frustration of a man who knows exactly how long a repair is going to take, and has 17 other things already waiting. Crouched down, looking at the pipe, when he heard footsteps behind him. Turned, expecting one of the horses to have gotten restless. Instead it was Ethan, dressed in his coat and boots, with a wool cap pulled down over his ears, carrying nothing but his own hands shoved into his pockets. "What are you doing out here?" Gideon said. "Couldn't sleep." The boy looked at the pipe, then at Gideon. "Wrong with it. Cracked at the joint. Needs wrapping or replacing." Ethan crouched beside him without asking permission and looked at the split with the same assessing expression his mother used for everything. "You got solder in the tool shed." "Why?" "My father used to fix pipes," Ethan said, not with nostalgia, just as information. "I helped him sometimes. Mostly I held the lamp." Gideon looked at him for a moment. 16 years old, out in a stranger's barn before dawn, offering information about his dead father in the same tone he might use to describe the weather. There was something in that combination that Gideon didn't quite know what to do with. "I'll get the solder," Gideon said. "I'll hold the lamp," Ethan said. They worked in the cold for 40 minutes without saying much else. Ethan held the light steady and handed tools when asked, and didn't offer opinions that weren't requested. Gideon noticed this. A boy who could be quiet was not a thing you took for granted. When they came back into the house, Clara was already up. She looked at them both, coming through the door, together. Her son with grease on his coat sleeve, Gideon with his hands red from the cold, and something moved across her face that she put away before it could be identified. "Coffee's on," she said, and turned back to the stove. The days that followed established a rhythm, though calling it a rhythm was perhaps generous. It was more like a series of daily negotiations that nobody formally acknowledged as negotiations. Gideon went about his work. Clara went about hers. The boys existed in the space between, and the space between was, it turned out, considerable. What Gideon had not anticipated, what no amount of practical thinking had prepared him for, was the sheer physical presence of 4 children in a house built for one person who preferred quiet. It wasn't loud, exactly. Clara ran a household where voices stayed at reasonable levels, and running indoors was not permitted, and mealtimes were taken sitting down. But there was a quality to the air that was different now, kind of density, as if the house itself was having to adjust to the new weight it was being asked to carry. Miles found the toolbox on the 3rd day. It was sitting in the corner of the mudroom where Gideon had moved it 6 months ago and hadn't moved back. Miles found it the way children find things, not by looking, but by existing in proximity to them long enough. And he sat on the mudroom floor for an entire afternoon, organizing its contents into arrangements that made sense to him. Gideon came in from the pasture to find every tool laid out in a line on the floorboards, sorted by some principle he couldn't immediately identify. "What are you doing?" he said. Miles looked up. He was 12, with a round face and careful hands, and the expression of someone who was about to explain something obvious without making it feel like an insult. "Some of these aren't sharp anymore," he said. "The ones that are supposed to be." Gideon looked at the line of tools. "And there's a whetstone on the shelf in the barn. I saw it this morning when I went to look at the horses." "You went into the barn by yourself?" Miles paused. "Was I not supposed to?" Gideon rubbed the back of his neck. "Just ask next time." "Okay." Miles looked at the tools. "Can I use the whetstone?" Gideon looked at the boy for a long moment. 12 years old, sitting on a mudroom floor in the middle of a Wyoming January, asking permission to sharpen tools that hadn't been properly sharpened since the fall before last. He thought about saying no. He thought about the 16 things on his list that needed sharp tools to complete. "I'll show you the angle," Gideon said. Miles was a quick learner, which Gideon had not expected and probably should have. By the end of the afternoon, he had sharpened 4 chisels and a draw knife and made only 2 mistakes, both of which were the kind that came from trying too hard rather than not trying hard enough. Gideon recognized that kind of mistake. He'd been making it his whole life. It was Caleb who noticed things first. Not noticed in the ordinary sense, everyone noticed things. Caleb noticed the things that existed in the space between the obvious things, the things you had to look sideways at to see at all. On the 4th morning, he came downstairs and sat at the table and looked at Gideon with his chin in his hands and said, "You didn't sleep again." Gideon was pouring coffee. He stopped. "What?" "Last night. You were up at 2 and again at 4. I heard you walking." "Old floorboards," Gideon said. "They make noise. They make different noise depending on who's walking." "Caleb's, your steps are heavier on the right. You favor your left foot." Clara was at the stove, and she didn't turn around, but something in the set of her shoulders suggested she was listening with more attention than her posture implied. "I hurt the right one a long time ago," Gideon said. "Fine. Does it hurt at night?" "Caleb," Clara said quietly. "It's a real question. Caleb said with the undefended sincerity of a 10-year-old who hadn't yet learned that some real questions were the wrong ones to ask aloud. Gideon sat down with his coffee. Sometimes, he said. In the cold, Caleb absorbed this. My teacher in Missouri had a bad knee. She said the cold made old hurts worse because the body remembers them. Your teacher was right. Caleb nodded, apparently satisfied. He picked up his fork and started eating, and the conversation moved on or didn't. It was hard to tell with Caleb because, with him, a conversation ending and a conversation being stored for later consideration looked identical from the outside. Gideon thought about it afterward, though. He thought about a 10-year-old boy who listened to footsteps in the night and counted the weight of them and drew conclusions from the pattern. He thought about what kind of life produced a child like that, a life where paying close attention to the people around you was not curiosity, but a survival skill, where you learned to read the room before you spoke, because the room had not always been safe. Thought about it, and then he set it down, because thinking about it too long made him feel something he wasn't ready to feel yet. The problem with Clara wasn't that she was difficult. The problem with Clara was that she was competent in ways that made the edges of Gideon's own competence visible by comparison. She had reorganized the pantry by the end of the first week. Not dramatically, she hadn't thrown anything out or moved things to places he couldn't find them. She had simply applied a logic to it that made it possible to see, at a glance, what was running low, and what was sufficient, and what was sitting in a position that was going to make it go bad before it was used. He had been running the pantry for 4 years on a system that was really just familiarity. He knew where things were, because he'd put them there, and they'd never moved. Her system was visible. His had been invisible to everyone except himself. He didn't say anything about the reorganization. He used it, without acknowledging it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. She fixed the sagging gutter on the north side of the house on a Tuesday afternoon while the boys were occupied. She didn't ask for help or announce her intention. He came around the side of the house to find her on the second rung of the ladder. He kept in the barn, her coat sleeves pushed up, despite the cold, refastening the gutter bracket with a wrench she'd found in the toolbox Miles had organized. He stood there for a second before he said anything. Going to do that, he said. I know, she said, without looking down. It's been on the list since before we arrived. I could see the mark on the wall where water had gotten behind it. He picked up the other end of the bracket so it didn't swing. They worked in silence for a few minutes. She moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned not to waste motion, and she didn't ask him to take over just because he was there, and she didn't pretend she needed him to confirm what she was doing was right. When she came down the ladder, she looked at the fixed bracket and then at him with a flat, practical expression. The right side is going to go the same way by March, she said. Screws are rusting at the base. I'll order new hardware in town. She nodded and picked up the wrench and walked back toward the house. He watched her go and felt the peculiar, uncomfortable sensation of being in his own home and not being entirely sure what his role in it was anymore. Noah was the one nobody knew quite what to do about. He was 5 young enough that the events of the last 18 months had settled into him in a way that couldn't be discussed or reasoned with, but only lived around. He didn't have nightmares every night, but he had them often enough that Clara's sleep was consistently interrupted. And on the nights he woke up badly, he would cry in that particular way, that small children cry when they're not quite awake. A sound that had no logic in it. Just fear, finding its way out of a body that didn't have words for it yet. The first time Gideon heard it 3 nights in, he lay in his room and stared at the ceiling and listened to Clara's footsteps moving to the boy's room, and her voice, low and steady, talking him back to wherever safe was for a 5-year-old in the dark. He didn't know why it stayed with him. He turned on his side and tried to go back to sleep, and couldn't. On the 4th night when it happened, he got up. He didn't go to the room. He went to the kitchen and built the fire up a little and heated milk on the stove, the way his own mother had done for him 35 years ago when the dark was too loud. He poured it into the smallest cup he had and left it sitting on the counter. In the morning, it was gone. Clara didn't mention it. Neither did he. But 2 days later, when Noah came down the stairs in the early morning, dragging the corner of his blanket, and stood in the kitchen doorway with the blurred, uncertain expression of someone not yet sure if they were actually awake, Gideon looked at him and said, Noah considered this very seriously. Yes, please, he said, in a voice that was mostly air. Gideon got up and heated it. Noah sat across the table from him and drank it slowly and looked at Gideon with those large, solemnly watchful eyes. He didn't say anything else. Gideon didn't say anything either. When the cup was empty, Noah slid down from the chair, still holding the blanket, and padded back upstairs. Gideon sat alone in the kitchen and listened to the house settle and didn't examine what had just happened. The first real test came 11 days in, and it came from outside. Frank Delbert had owned the land on the eastern edge of the Voss property boundary for 14 years, and for 13 and a half of those years he and Gideon had maintained the kind of relationship that working neighbors maintain when they've had one serious disagreement and agreed by mutual unspoken consent never to fully resolve it. They were civil. They were wary. They operated on parallel tracks that occasionally crossed but never converged. Delbert arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning in a buckboard, with two of his ranch hands sitting in the back, which was not a configuration that suggested a social call. Gideon met him in the yard. Voss, Delbert said from the seat of the buckboard. He was a large man who had been larger once and was in the process of softening in the way that men who'd been physical all their lives sometimes did in their 50s, the muscle losing its argument with time. He had a broad face and small eyes, and the expression of someone who'd decided before arriving that the conversation was going to go his way. Delbert, Gideon said, heard you took in a woman and some boys. Heard correctly. Delbert looked at the house. Seems like an unusual arrangement for a man in your situation. My situation's my business. Sure. Delbert shifted in the seat. I'll get to it then. My east fence came down in the last storm. 60 feet of it. Some of your cattle are on my pasture. This was not impossible. Gideon had checked his herd 2 days ago, but the eastern boundary was the longest, and he hadn't walked the full line. I'll get them back today, Gideon said. Thing is, Delbert said, and this was the part where the two ranch hands in the back were relevant. 2 of those cattle had been on my land long enough to eat a fair portion of my winter feed. I'm thinking compensation's in order. Gideon looked at him evenly. 2 animals that crossed a fence that was your fence to maintain. Fence posts are on your property line. That hasn't been settled. I say it has. Delbert smiled, which was somehow worse than when he wasn't smiling. Look, Voss, I know you're stretched. 60 head is a lean winter. I'm just saying compensation for the feed. The cattle back where they belong, and we call it square. Clara came out of the house. She had probably heard the wagon arrive. She wasn't carrying anything or pretending to have a reason to be outside. She simply came out and stood on the porch steps with her arms folded and looked at the situation with the expression of a woman who had developed, through long practice, a very accurate sense of when a man was being taken advantage of. Delbert looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything. Who's this? Delbert said to Gideon. Mrs. Whitmore, Gideon said. She manages the household. That's so. Delbert looked at her a moment longer in the way that some men looked at women who appeared in places they hadn't expected them, then turned back to Gideon. So compensation. For what amount? Clara said. Both men turned. Delbert's expression moved through several positions before settling on something that was trying to be pleasant. That's between myself and Mr. Voss, ma'am. You said his cattle ate your feed, Clara said. She came down 1 step. Feed has a price per bushel. How much feed by your estimate? Delbert looked at her with the particular displeasure of a man who had not expected to need an answer to a specific question. I'd say a fair amount. A fair amount isn't a number, Clara said. What did 2 animals eat, and how long were they on your land? I can't say exactly. 2 days, 3? I'd say 3. Then 2 animals, 3 days late winter pasture. It's a calculable amount, Mr. Delbert. I'd want to see the figure on paper before anyone agreed to anything. The yard was very quiet for a moment. One of the ranch hands in the buckboard looked at the other one. The other one looked at his boots. Delbert's face had done something complicated and settled into a tight, controlled expression. He looked at Gideon. "You let her speak for you?" she asked. "A reasonable question," Gideon said. "So did I. I'll bring the cattle back today. If you can give me a number in writing, I'll look at it." Delbert held his gaze for a long moment. Then he picked up the reins. "I'll send a note," he said, and the buckboard moved. Gideon stood in the yard and watched it go. Behind him, Clara descended the last 2 steps and came to stand beside him, not quite at his shoulder. "He won't send a note," she said. "No," Gideon said. "He won't. Because he didn't have a real number. He was just seeing what you'd agree to." Gideon looked at her sidelong. "Have you dealt with men like that before?" "My husband's family," she said simply. "After he died, they wanted the house. They said he'd borrowed money from them that we owed back. There was no paper, no amount, just pressure and expectation." She paused. "A number in writing is the thing they never have." Gideon thought about that. "I'll go get the cattle this afternoon," he said. "Ethan can come. He should know the east boundary line anyway." Clara looked at him, not surprised exactly, but registering something. "He'd do well with that," she said. "I know," Gideon said, and walked toward the barn. Ethan did well with it. He rode without complaint through the cold, which Gideon had expected. What he hadn't expected was the quality of the boy's attention, the way he looked at the fence line not just as a boundary to find cattle on the other side of, but as a system with logic and weak points, and places where the logic had failed. He spotted 2 more sections that needed work before Gideon pointed them out. He helped cut the cattle back through the gap without being shown the technique, reading the animal's movement, and anticipating where they'd try to break before they did. Riding back in the gray afternoon light, Gideon said, "You've worked cattle before?" "Some," Ethan said. "We had 3 in Missouri. My father let me help with them." "3's not the same as 60. "No." Ethan was quiet a moment. "But the basic thing is the same, isn't it? You have to think like them before you can move them." Gideon looked at the boy riding beside him, the hard set of the jaw that was trying to pass as indifference, the way he held the reins, confident but not careless, learned from watching rather than formal instruction. "Your mother said your father died of fever," Gideon said, 18 months ago. Ethan's voice didn't change. "May, you were 14. Nearly 15. He looked at the flat horizon. "I tried to keep us in the house. Worked 2 jobs for 6 months. The rent was more than I could make, and his family wanted us out, and he stopped." Adjusted something in his expression. "We left." Gideon didn't say anything for a while. "That's a lot to carry for a 15-year-old, he finally said. "Someone had to." Ethan said it without self-pity, just as a fact. Someone had to, and the someone available was him, so that was that. They rode the rest of the way back, mostly in silence. But it was a different silence than the one they'd left. With it had more information in it, and information, Gideon had always found, had a way of changing the quality of a silence, whether you wanted it to or not. 3 weeks into the arrangement, Clara found the account ledger. She wasn't looking for it. She was reorganizing the shelf in the front room where Gideon kept papers and invoices and the general accumulation of documents that a ranch produced, and the ledger was under a stack of supply receipts from the fall. Put it back immediately. It wasn't her ledger, and she hadn't been asked to look at it. But she'd seen enough in the 2 seconds before she put it back to understand the shape of what was in it, and the shape of what was in it was not a healthy shape. That evening, after the boys had gone upstairs, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cooling tea and thought about what she'd seen. Not the numbers specifically, she'd only caught a glimpse, but the pattern of them. The red ink that showed up more in the last column than the black. "You're thinking hard about something," Gideon said from across the room. He was at the bench by the window where he'd been mending a harness strap. "I'm always thinking hard about something," she said. He didn't dispute that. He worked the awl through the leather and didn't look up. "The ledger on the front shelf," she said. He stopped. I wasn't looking, she said quickly. I was reorganizing. Put it back, but I saw. She stopped. I don't mean to overstep. He set the harness down. He looked at her across the room, and his face was doing the thing it did when he was deciding how much of something to say. The last 2 winters were hard, he said finally. Lost 30 head between the 2 of them. Emergency vet bills for what I couldn't save. Feed costs running high because I couldn't put enough in the barn before prices went up in November. He paused. I'm not in the ground, but I'm not comfortable either. No, I could see that. Another silence. That's why you were willing to take on a housekeeper, she said. Not an accusation, just working out the shape of the thing. A housekeeper is cheaper than the alternative, he said. Hiring a full hand costs twice what a placement arrangement costs. I needed the labor, but I needed it at the right price. He looked at the harness. A woman who could manage the household and keep the books orderly and do it. For fair wages was a practical calculation. And then I arrived with 4 children. And then you arrived with 4 children, he agreed. Clara turned her teacup in her hands. My wages are less than you'd have paid for a single ranch hand, she said. I know that. I'm doing more than a single ranch hand's work. The household, the supplies, the pantry. Your account books, if you wanted them organized properly. Cooking, she paused. I'm not saying that to complain. I know you're not. I'm saying it because if you're going to get through the spring in the black, the books need to be organized in a way you can actually make decisions from. And if you want, I can do that. She looked at him directly. I kept my husband's accounts for 6 years. I know what I'm looking at. Gideon sat very still for a moment. That's not what the placement was for, he said. No, Clara agreed. But this is where we are. He looked at her for a long time. She didn't look away. The ledger's on the front shelf, he said, under the receipts. I know where it is, she said. She got up and got it and came back to the table and opened it. And Gideon moved his chair from the window to the table and sat across from her. And together they started working through the numbers in the way that 2 people worked through numbers when they both understood the importance of the work, and neither was trying to make the other feel small about it. And the took until nearly midnight. When they were done, Clara had a clearer picture than she wanted, and a plan that was tighter than comfortable, and a list of 6 places where current spending could be reduced without compromising the herd's survival through to April. She laid it out, and Gideon looked at it and pointed to 2 items and said they wouldn't work and explained why. And she adjusted the plan. And by the time the fire was burning low, they had something that wasn't a rescue plan, but was at least a map. You could have hired a bookkeeper, she said, closing the ledger. Bookkeepers cost money, he said. So does not having one. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. It was more like the muscles near his mouth, considering the option and declining at the last second. But the consideration itself was visible. Get some sleep, he said. Miles wants to do the tools again tomorrow, and I told him I'd show him how to file the saw teeth. Clara stood and picked up the ledger to return it to the shelf. Did Miles ask you to show him? He mentioned it. He mentioned it, she repeated. And something in her voice was careful, the way a person was careful with a thing they didn't want to break by handling it too directly. She put the ledger back and folded the notes she'd made into her apron pocket. He's been following you around, you know. Not close enough for you to notice. Close. Gideon was banking the fire, his back to her. He didn't respond to that. Good night, Mr. Voss, she said. Good night, he said. She went upstairs, and he stayed by the fire for a while longer than he needed to, doing nothing in particular, just standing there in the diminishing warmth of it, listening to the house around him and not thinking about any one thing specifically, which was sometimes the only way he could think about all of it at once. The wind was up again. It always was. But inside, the lamp on the front shelf was still lit from where they'd been working, and it threw a small circle of light onto the organized papers beneath it, and outside the temperature was dropping towards something serious. And in this house that had been empty for 4 years, There were 5 other people breathing in the dark, and Gideon stood by the cooling stove and did not know what to do with any of it. He did not know, but he stayed. The letter from the agency arrived on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after Clara and the boys had come to the Voss ranch, and it came tucked between a supply invoice and a notice from the Cheyenne land office in the stack of mail that Gideon collected from town. He didn't open it right away. He set the stack on the front shelf the way he always did, and went back out to finish what he'd been doing, a section of fence on the north pasture that had been weakening since December and finally given up entirely during the wind event 3 nights prior. He and Ethan spent the afternoon working on it, the boy learning to read tension in wire the way Gideon had learned it from his own father 2 decades back. And by the time they came in at dusk with cold hands and sore shoulders, Gideon had forgotten about the letter entirely. He remembered it after supper. He opened it standing at the front shelf, still in his coat, while Clara washed dishes in the kitchen, and the sound of Miles and Caleb arguing about something's upstairs filtered down through the ceiling in the way sounds did in an old house where nothing was quite soundproof. He read it once, then he read it again. The letter was from a man named Horace Alderman, who identified himself as the administrative director of the Western Placement Agency, operating out of Denver, Colorado. The tone was brisk and professional, and carried the particular quality of a letter written by someone who spent a great deal of time managing uncomfortable situations with paperwork. Acknowledged in the 3rd paragraph that a clerical error had resulted in Mrs. Clara Whitmore being dispatched to the Voss ranch under incorrect terms that she had been led to understand. The placement was a marital arrangement when the file on record clearly stated typing services only. The agency regretted the confusion. The agency took its responsibilities to its clients seriously. And then came the part that Gideon read 3 times. Agency was prepared to offer Mrs. Whitmore an immediate alternative placement given the circumstances. Family in Laramie, a widower named Mr. Thomas Hale, 3 children, established household, specifically requesting a woman for permanent domestic arrangement, with the possibility of formal marriage within a reasonable period. Transportation would be arranged at agency expense. Placement would begin at the end of the current month. Moat. At the bottom of the letter, in a separate paragraph that had the quality of an afterthought, that was actually the main point. We trust this resolves the matter to all parties' satisfaction and removes any ongoing obligation or discomfort from the current arrangement. Gideon stood at the shelf and looked at the letter for a while, longer than was strictly necessary to understand what it said. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket and went to bed without mentioning it. He did not sleep. The thing about a secret, even one you were keeping, for practical reasons, even one you were holding only temporarily while you figured out what to do with it, was that it changed how you moved through a room. Gideon had always been a man of consistent behavior, and inconsistency was the thing that observant people noticed first. Caleb noticed at breakfast. He sat across the table with his chin in his hand and watched Gideon drink his coffee with the look of a small scientist, observing an experiment that was not going the way the textbook predicted. "Something happened," Caleb said. "Nothing happened," Gideon said. "Something happened yesterday after supper." Caleb tilted his head slightly. "You went to the front shelf. You stood there a long time. Then you went to bed without saying anything. That's not unusual. You usually bank the fire first. You didn't bank the fire. I had to get up and do it." Clara, at the stove, turned slightly. "Not enough to be obvious." "I was tired," Gideon said. Caleb looked at him steadily. He did not appear to believe this, but he had enough social awareness, more than most adults gave him credit for, to understand when a thing was being deliberately closed, and he let it close. Picked up his fork and started eating. But Clara's posture at the stove had changed, just slightly. The kind of change that only registered to someone who'd been paying attention to it long enough to have a baseline. After breakfast, when Ethan had taken Miles and Caleb out to help check the water troughs and Noah was still upstairs, Clara came back to the kitchen table and poured herself a second cup of coffee and sat down. She didn't look at Gideon. She just sat there and drank her coffee, and the quality of the silence between them was different from the usual morning silence. It had a question in it that she hadn't asked yet. He reached into his coat, which was hanging on the hook by the door, and took out the letter. He set it on the table in front of her and went to the window. She read it slowly. He didn't watch her, but he heard the silence change quality again. As she moved through the paragraphs, a kind of compression, like a person taking something in carefully to make sure they understood it before they reacted to it. When she finished, she put it down flat on the table with both hands on it. "When did this arrive?" she asked. "Yesterday. You didn't say anything." I needed to think. "About what?" Her voice was even. Not cold, just controlled, in the way it always was when she was managing something that had the potential to tip. Gideon turned from the window. "About how to tell you." She looked at him across the kitchen. Her hands were still flat on the letter. "The decision is yours," he said. "I want to be clear about that. The decision is entirely yours." "I know that," she said. "Laramie isn't far. If it's he started again. The arrangement there is what you were looking for in the first place. What you came west for." Clara looked down at the letter. She was quiet for a long time. "Did you read all of it?" she asked. "I read all of it." "Thomas Hale," she said. 3 children. Established household. She paused. "Do you know anything about him?" "No." "The agency said nothing about him except what's on the page." She lifted one hand off the letter and set it in her lap. "The last time I trusted the agency's characterization of a situation, I arrived expecting a husband and found a man who wanted a housekeeper. That sat in the air between them. I'm not saying the Hale situation is like this one," she said. I'm saying I don't know what I'd be walking into. And I have 4 children who've been through enough walking into things they didn't know." "That's fair," Gideon said. "Is it what you want?" she asked. "For us to go." He opened his mouth and then closed it again, which was not the immediate denial she'd perhaps expected. And for a fraction of a second, something moved across her face before she controlled it. "I want you to have the choice," he said. "That's what I want." She looked at him steadily. "That's not an answer, Mr. Voss." He looked back at her. "No," he said. "It's not." He picked up his coat and went outside, and the door closed behind him with the quiet firmness of a man who had said both too much and not enough, and who knew it. The letter spent the rest of that day on the kitchen shelf, where Clara had put it after breakfast, sitting under the edge of the flour canister, where it could be seen but not advertised. Boys didn't notice it. Or if they did, they didn't ask Ethan, because he'd developed the habit of observing his mother's signals, and her signal all day was not now, and the younger ones because they were occupied with their own small concerns, the way children were. Noah had decided, sometime in the past week, that the barn cat was his specific responsibility. Cat, a gray and white tom of uncertain age and disagreeable temperament that Gideon called nothing, because naming ranch animals was an investment he'd stopped making, had resisted Noah's attention for several days before apparently concluding that the boy's persistence was not going to relent, and that acceptance was more efficient than continued resistance. Now Noah spent portions of each afternoon in the barn with the cat, talking to it in a low, continuous murmur that Gideon had heard through the wall once, without meaning to. A long, private account of various things Noah had observed, or thought about, or wondered, delivered to an audience of one gray and white tom who sat with his eyes half closed, and the profound patience of a creature that had long ago made peace with not understanding everything. Gideon had watched this happen over 10 days and had not interfered with it, which was a kind of decision in itself. That afternoon, Miles came to find him in the tool shed, where Gideon was attempting to repair the seat mechanism on the old cultivator, a job that required 3 hands and the patience of a man who'd been cultivating patience for 41 years with mixed results. "Can I help?" Miles asked from the doorway. "You can hold this," Gideon said, indicating the crossbar that needed to stay level while he fixed the fastening pin. Miles came in without ceremony and took hold of the bar and held it at exactly the right tension without being shown what right tension felt like. He just seemed to know the way he seemed to know a lot of things about how physical systems wanted to behave. They worked for 20 minutes without talking. It was companionable in a way that Gideon hadn't entirely expected. Working alongside a 12-year-old, there was none of the social obligation that came with adult company, none of the need to fill silence with something that sounded like progress. "My mother got a letter," Miles said. Gideon kept his eyes on the pin. "Gets letters sometimes." "This one was different," Miles said. "Put it under the flour tin." "Is that different?" "She puts things under the flour tin when she doesn't want us to find them, but she's not ready to throw them away." He paused. "She put my father's last letter there for 2 weeks before she could read it. After he died, the hospital sent his things." Gideon stopped what he was doing. He looked at Miles across the mechanism between them. The boy was holding the bar steady and looking at it with a face that had made itself neutral on purpose, which was its own kind of expression. "I don't know what's in your mother's letter," Gideon said, which was close enough to true that he was willing to say it. "Okay," Miles said. "She'll tell you what she wants you to know when she decides." "I know." He adjusted his grip on the bar. "We've moved 3 times since my father died. Missouri, then Kansas, then here." He said it without complaint, just laying it out. "Caleb doesn't say anything about it, but he doesn't sleep well when we're about to move. He gets quiet in a different way." Gideon thought about Caleb's face at breakfast. "Noah's better here than he's been since Missouri," Miles continued. "He's sleeping through most nights. He likes the cat." "I know," Gideon said. "I'm not asking you anything," Miles said carefully. "I'm just saying what I know." Gideon looked at the boy for a moment. Then he went back to the pin. "Hold it steady," he said. "I am holding it steady," Miles said. That night, Gideon did something he hadn't done in 4 years. He took the bottle of rye from the back of the cupboard where he'd put it in November and poured himself a glass and sat at the kitchen table with it, and the account ledger that Clara had organized, and he worked through the numbers again, the way she'd walked him through them 3 weeks prior, not looking for a different answer, but looking at what the answer actually meant. If they left at the end of the month, as the agency proposed, he would need to find another housekeeping arrangement before the spring work started. Cost of that, added to the current deficits in the ledger, put him in a position that was manageable but tight. He could do it. He'd done tight before. The ranch would keep running it, alone. He sat with that thought and the glass of rye and let himself feel the actual shape of it, which he hadn't done yet. He'd been thinking about the logistics, the practicalities, the numbers, and the numbers were just numbers. They weren't the thing underneath the numbers. He thought about Ethan on the fence line, reading the wire. He thought about Miles, holding things level. He thought about Caleb, who heard footsteps at 2 a.m. and counted what they meant. He thought about Noah and the gray and white cat and the low, private murmur of a small boy explaining the world to an animal that would never understand it. He finished the glass and didn't pour another. He picked up the ledger and a piece of paper and wrote down 3 things. Not a plan exactly, more like a position he wanted to be clear about. He looked at what he'd written for a while, then folded it and left it on the table. He went to bed, and this time he slept in the fitful, interrupted way that a decision half-made allows. The next morning, Clara came downstairs before Gideon was up, which was unusual. She was typically in the kitchen by 5, but he was typically in the barn by 4:45. She found the folded paper on the table and stood looking at it for a moment before she unfolded it. He had written 3 things. The east fence line needs rebuilding in spring, 600 feet at minimum. 2 people, 6 days. The north pasture soil has been compacted 3 winters running. Needs turning before May or the summer grass won't come. The account ledger needs to be kept current through April, or the spring supply decisions won't be sound. That was all. No argument, no appeal, no statement of what he wanted or what he felt, because those were not things he knew how to put on paper. Just 3 true facts about a ranch that needed people who knew it now, people who had spent 6 weeks learning what it needed and would need them more as the year turned toward work. Clara stood at the table and read it twice, Then she folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket and started the fire. 3 days passed without the letter being discussed, which might have seemed like avoidance, but was in practice something more like both of them needing room to think without the pressure of the other person's presence making thinking impossible. Gideon worked. Clara worked. The boys fell into their rhythms, Ethan more reliable, each day in the barn and the pasture, Miles with his tools and his quiet competence, Caleb watching everything, Noah with his cat and his earnest, low-voiced conversations with it. On the 4th day, something happened that none of them had planned for, and that, in retrospect, was the thing that broke the suspended quality of the waiting. Caleb got hurt. It wasn't serious, not the way things could be serious on a ranch in winter, not the kind of serious that required a doctor or left a lasting mark. But it was sudden, and it was frightening in the way that sudden things were, when you weren't prepared for them. And the fear of it did something to the careful, managed quality of the situation that no amount of deliberate thinking could have done. He'd been on the lower barn roof. Gideon had pointed out 2 days earlier that a section of the roof's lower edge had a board working loose, and he'd mentioned it without directing anyone specifically to fix it, which Caleb had apparently interpreted as an open commission. He'd gotten up there using the fence rail as a step and a handhold on the rain gutter, the same gutter his mother had fixed on the north side of the house, and he'd been attempting to press the board back into position with his hands when the gutter bracket gave way. He didn't fall far. The barn roof had a shallow pitch at the lower edge, and he landed in the loose hay that had blown against the barn wall over the winter, a pile of it 18 inches deep, which was the thing that turned a bad fall into a breathless one. He lay in the hay and stared at the sky and couldn't immediately find his air. Gideon reached him first, because he'd been nearest. He'd come around the barn corner and seen the bracket give and moved before he'd consciously decided to. Crouched beside the boy in the hay and put one hand on his chest and said, "Don't move." Caleb, who could not have moved if he'd wanted to, looked up at him with wide eyes and the particular expression of someone who has just experienced their body doing something completely outside of their control. "It knocked the wind," Gideon said. "It'll come back. Just wait." Caleb waited. His eyes stayed on Gideon's face with an intensity that went beyond the physical, the intensity of a child looking at an adult he needed to trust in this moment and checking very fast whether that trust was going to hold. "There," Gideon said when Caleb's chest moved. "There it is." Caleb got his air back in a rush, and then got very still again, and then made a sound that was not quite crying, but was adjacent to it. The kind of sound a body made when it had been frightened past the point where dignity was the primary concern. Gideon sat back on his heels and let the boy have it. He didn't tell him to stop. He didn't tell him he was fine, because the truth was he didn't know yet if he was fine, and telling a scared child that they were fine before you knew was just noise. He sat in the hay next to Caleb Whitmore and waited, and when the sound subsided into ragged breathing, and then into something more controlled, he said, "Can you feel your legs?" "Yes," Caleb said. "Arms?" "Yes." "Where does it hurt?" Caleb considered. "Shoulder, hip, mostly the shoulder." "Move the shoulder for me." Caleb moved it, winced, but moved it fully. "Not broken," Gideon said. "Banged up. You're going to be sore for a week." He paused. "What were you doing on the roof?" "You said the board was loose." I said the board was loose. I didn't say climb up and fix it yourself." "You didn't say not to," Caleb said. Gideon looked at him. The boy was still lying in the hay with his eyes on the sky, breathing carefully, and he looked younger than 10 years old. From this angle he looked exactly as old as he was, which was a child who had been paying so much attention to everything around him for so long that he'd stopped factoring in his own size and limitations. "No," Gideon said. "I didn't say not to." He stood and held out a hand. "Up." Caleb took the hand and got up with some effort and a sharply inhaled breath when his weight went through the shoulder. "What do you tell your mother?" Gideon said. "That I fell," Caleb said immediately. "Because I did." And a pause. and that I was somewhere I shouldn't have been without asking. Good, Gideon said. They walked back to the house together with Caleb moving carefully and Gideon matching his pace without making a production of it. Clara saw them from the kitchen window before they got to the door. By the time they came inside, she was already at the table, and her eyes went over Caleb the way a mother's eyes went over a child, fast and thorough, and looking for the thing that wasn't visible. Fell off the lower barn roof, Caleb said before she could ask. Shoulder and hip. Not broken. I was somewhere I shouldn't have been. Clara looked at Gideon. He's right on all counts, Gideon said. She looked at Caleb for another long moment. Then she pulled out a chair. Sit down. Let me look at the shoulder. She examined the shoulder with careful hands, pressing along the joint, the way. Someone did, who had done this before, not a doctor's competence exactly, but a mother's competence, which in a household without a doctor was the practical equivalent. Caleb held still and endured it. You're going to be bruised from here to your elbow by tomorrow, she said. I know, Caleb said. She looked at his face then, really looked at it, the way she looked at things she was trying to fully understand. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to find it, because something in her posture shifted, not releasing tension, but acknowledging a different kind of it. Thank you, she said to Gideon. He landed in the hay, Gideon said. He mostly managed it himself. He has a habit of doing that, she said. She was looking at Caleb when she said it, and her voice had a softness in it that she didn't often allow to be visible. Caleb looked at his hands. I knew the hay was there, he said. Of course you did, Clara said. That night after Caleb was in bed and the rest of the boys had settled, and the house had reached its late-night equilibrium of small sounds and wind and the fire working down, Clara came to the kitchen table and sat across from Gideon and put the letter in front of her and the piece of paper he'd written, the one with the 3 facts about the ranch beside it. She looked at both of them. He waited. The agency doesn't know Thomas Hale any better than they knew you, she said. It's the honest truth of it. They put a name and 3 children and a location on a piece of paper, and that's the sum of what they know. That's probably true, he said. I came here because I needed somewhere, she said. Not just to be housed. Somewhere that made sense for 4 boys who needed to stop moving long enough to become who they were going to be. She paused. I think I'd recognized that it had started here, and then this arrived. She touched the letter. Caleb on that roof today, she said. He got up there because he was paying attention, and he decided it was something he could do. She looked up at Gideon. He's been deciding things like that his whole life because I needed him to, and his father needed him to, and there's never been anyone else available to make those kinds of decisions. She paused. This afternoon you sat in the hay with him until he found his breath. You didn't explain it. You didn't manage it. You just sat there. Gideon didn't say anything. That's not a small thing, Clara said, to a 10-year-old who's been the one watching for everyone else. Fire made its sounds. If we go to Laramie, she said slowly, we will have gone somewhere. Thomas Hale may be a good man. Probably is. But my children will have moved 4 times in 18 months, and this will have been a place they stayed for a month and then left, and it will have meant nothing. She looked at the letter. If we stay, she said, I don't know what it becomes. I know what it's been so far. Hard and useful and real, in the way things are real, when you can't smooth over the rough parts of them. She looked at him. But I don't know what it becomes, do you? He looked back at her. No, he said, but I know what I'd like it to become. She waited. A working ranch, he said, with enough hands to do the work properly, with the books kept in order. He paused. With people who know the east fence line and the north pasture and which way the wind comes before a storm. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't the declaration of something large and sweeping. It was in the way that Gideon communicated things, as close to one as he was capable of making. Clara sat with it. I'd need wages, she said. Fair ones. Not what the agency set. I know. We'd have to work out a number. And the arrangement would have to be clear, she said. What I am here, not placement, not temporary. That's fair. The boys would have to be treated as not yours. I'm not asking for that, but not invisible either. They're not invisible, he said. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved across the plain with the authority it always had. Out here, massive and indifferent and too large to argue with. "There's some things I need to tell you," she said. He looked at her. "The agency made a mistake when they sent me here," she said, "but not the mistake they think they made." She turned the letter over so she didn't have to look at it. "They said they sent me to the wrong man. But the mistake was that they didn't know enough about either of us to send me to the right one, deliberately." She paused. "They sent me here by accident, and it worked out, by accident, and that is not the same as it being wrong." Gideon sat across the table from her and didn't speak, because speaking would have covered something that was better left uncovered for a moment. "I'm not writing to them tomorrow," Clara said, "but I need to think through what I'm going to write, and I need a few more days to think it." "That's fair," he said. "I'm not going to Laramie," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "All right," he said. She picked up the letter and folded it and stood. Then she stopped, holding it, and looked at him once more across the kitchen table in the dim, honest light of a house at night. "The 3 things you wrote down," she said, "about the fence and the pasture and the ledger. Yes. You could have hired hands for all 3. Not at the right price," he said. She almost smiled. It was close enough to one that it counted. "Good night, Mr. Voss," she said. "Good night," he said. She went upstairs, and Gideon sat alone at the table in the cooling kitchen and looked at the place where both pieces of paper had been and were no longer, and he thought about what she'd said. It worked out by accident, and that is not the same as it being wrong, and found that the more he turned it over, the more it held up under the turning. He banked the fire properly this time. He went to bed, and above him, in the room across the hall from her sleeping sons, Clara Whitmore lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and held the letter loosely in her hand. And after a while she stopped thinking about Laramie and started thinking about spring and the east fence and what 600 feet of wire fencing would cost and what kind of soil turned well after 3 years of compaction and whether Caleb's shoulder would be recovered enough in 2 weeks to help with the lighter work. She thought about all of it for a long time before sleep came, and when it came with the particular quality of sleep that follows a decision not one fully made, but one whose direction had become clear. And in the barn outside, the gray and white cat sat on its favorite rafter in the dark and attended to the serious business of being itself, and somewhere in the house above him, the small boy, who had decided it was his responsibility, slept through the night without waking for the 4th night in a row. The few days Clara had asked for to think stretched into a week, and the week had its own weather. Not the dramatic kind. There was no blizzard, no crisis, no external event that forced a resolution. Just the ordinary accumulation of cold mornings and work, and the particular quality of life on a Wyoming ranch in late winter, when the days were beginning to lengthen by small, measurable increments, but the cold had not received the newsies yet, and continued operating on its own schedule. The letter from the agency stayed wherever Clara had put it. Neither of them mentioned it, but it was present in the house the way unresolved things were present, not visible, but occupying space. The way a stone under a floorboard occupied space, felt in the give of the board without being seen. Gideon went about his work and watched the situation without appearing to watch it, which was a skill he'd developed over many years of working with animals that spooked easily if they felt observed. What he saw was this: Clara was not preparing to leave. A woman preparing to leave organized things differently. She consolidated. She left margins. She did the work of making her absence manageable. Clara doing the opposite. Clara was doing the opposite. She'd started a fully of the spring supply needs, cross-referenced against the account ledger, producing a document that was frankly more useful than anything Gideon had assembled on his own in 4 years. She'd identified 3 areas of household spending that could be reduced without meaningful impact, and 2 where underspending had been creating problems that cost more to fix, later the kind of analysis that only made sense if you were going to be around to implement it. He didn't comment on this. He used the inventory. What he also saw in this, he looked at more carefully. More privately was the way the boys were settling. Not dramatically, not in the way that would have made a good story with a clear before and after. Just the accumulating evidence of children who had stopped bracing for the next disruption. Ethan was the clearest example. The rigid self-sufficiency of the first weeks had not disappeared. It was too deeply built into him for that, but it had started to show cracks of a different kind than the defensive ones. He'd begun asking Gideon questions, practical questions, specifically about the herd's grazing rotation, about the water rights on the eastern creek, about why Gideon had planted the windbreak trees where he had and not closer to the barn. Questions that only mattered if you were thinking about the land in terms of future seasons rather than just getting through the current one. Gideon answered them without making a production of the fact that they were being asked. Storms that changed everything arrived on a Saturday. Wyoming storms in February were not unusual and not, generally speaking, surprising. The sky gave warning. The temperature dropped in a particular way. The horses got restless in a manner that Gideon had learned to read the same way he read the ledger, looking for the pattern underneath the individual numbers. He'd seen this one coming since Thursday. He'd spent Friday moving feed into the barn and checking the outbuilding doors and making sure the water situation could be managed for at least 2 days without needing to go far from the house. What he hadn't fully accounted for was how fast it moved. By Saturday noon, the sky had gone from steel gray to the white gray that meant serious business, and by 2 in the afternoon, the wind had reached the kind of velocity that made forward motion outdoors, a project that required intention. The boys had been called inside by noon. Clara had banked the kitchen stove higher than usual and brought additional wood into the mudroom. Gideon was in the barn, doing the final checks when the temperature dropped another 10 degrees in what felt like 20 minutes. He came in from the barn to find the kitchen organized against the storm in the competent, unsentimental way. Clara organized things, everything necessary within reach, nothing unnecessary in the way. The household reduced to its essentials, with the tidiness of someone who had made decisions in advance, so she wouldn't have to make them in the middle of things. How bad? She asked. Bad enough, he said, stamping snow off his boots. I've seen worse, but not this fast. It'll be through by morning if we're lucky. Maybe noon tomorrow if we're not. Noah was at the table with a cup of warm milk, the cat conspicuously absent. The animal had apparently made its own assessment of the weather and was installed somewhere deep in the barn's hay. Miles was on the bench near the window with a harness piece he'd been attempting to repair for 3 days, working at it with the focused patience he brought to everything mechanical. Caleb was on the stairs, not at the table, not fully upstairs, just at the midpoint between the two spaces, which was where Caleb went when he was processing something. Ethan was not in the house. Gideon noticed this in the way you noticed an absence when you'd been counting, without realizing you were counting. Where's Ethan? He asked. Clara turned from the stove. He went to check the north fence line. He said he'd be back before it got bad. Gideon looked at the window. The visibility through it had degraded in the 10 minutes since he'd come in from the barn. What had been identifiable as the distant fence posts of the near pasture was now a white-gray blur with wind moving across it in sheets. When did he go? Gideon said. 40 minutes ago, Clara said, and her voice had changed quality. 40 minutes. The north fence line was a 15-minute walk in good conditions. In the current conditions, moving into the wind coming from the northwest, it was longer than that and significantly harder. Gideon turned and picked up the coat he'd just taken off. I'll go, he said. I'll come. No, he said. Stay with the others. He pulled the coat back on and reached for the heavier scarf on the hook. The rope in the barn, I'll run a line to the pasture gate. If I'm not back in an hour, don't tell me what to do in an hour, Clara said. Come back in 30 minutes. He looked at her. Her face had the expression it got when she was frightened and managing it, which was a version of her face he'd learned to identify as distinct from her simply focused expression, the jaw a fraction tighter, the eyes doing something at the edges. I'll find him, Gideon said. He went back out into the storm. The Cold hit him differently the second time because the temperature had continued to fall in the minutes he'd been inside, and the wind had developed the kind of direction that meant it pushed into you from multiple angles depending on which way you turned. He kept his head down and moved by memory. He'd walked the line from house to barn to North Pasture Gate so many times over the years that his feet knew it without his eyes, which was a useful thing when his eyes were primarily occupied with keeping snow out of them. He got the rope from the barn and tied it to the gatepost and moved into the north pasture, with the rope paying out behind him, giving him a return line in the diminishing visibility. He found Ethan 40 yards into the pasture. The boy was on his feet, which was the important thing on his feet, and moving back toward the house with his head down and his coat pulled close, fighting the wind with the stubborn, methodical determination that was apparently a characteristic he'd developed independently of any instruction. He'd walked the fence line and found a post down and reset it with a rock to brace it temporarily. Gideon could see the repair as he came up alongside the boy, a serviceable emergency fix that would hold until the storm passed and a proper reset could be done. "I told you to wait," Gideon said, though he hadn't. Ethan looked up at him through the snow on his lashes. "Post was down," he said, as if this explained everything, which in Ethan's operational framework it probably did. The post could have waited until tomorrow. The northwest wind was going to take more fence with it if the post stayed down, Ethan said. "Once one goes, the tension changes on the next 3. He was right. Gideon had known this himself and hadn't thought of it in time to prevent the boy from acting on it, which was its own kind of information. "Come on," Gideon said, and turned back toward the house. They came in through the back together. Clara had heard them on the step and was at the door before they reached it, and she looked at Ethan the way she'd looked at Caleb. After the barn roof, fast and thorough, the maternal inventory, and then she stepped back and let them in and shut the door against the wind with the full weight of her body. Ethan stood in the mudroom, dripping melted snow and breathing hard. His coat had done its job, mostly, but his hands were red in a way that suggested the gloves he'd worn were not adequate for what the temperature had become. Clara took his hands between hers without asking. He let her, which was significant. Ethan did not typically allow the helpfulness of others when he could avoid it. "Fine," she said, after a moment. "But you're done going outside today." "The post?" Gideon saw the post, she said. "It'll hold until tomorrow." Ethan looked at Gideon. "It'll hold," Gideon confirmed. Something in Ethan's posture shifted a fractional releasing, the specific tension of someone who has been holding a responsibility, finally being permitted to set it down. He sat on the mudroom bench and pulled off his boots and didn't say anything else. Gideon caught Clara's eyes over the boy's head. He gave her a small nod that meant the fence repair had been done correctly, and he saw her absorb this, and the tightness around her eyes eased by a degree. The storm kept them all inside for the rest of that day and into the night. By 5 in the afternoon, the visibility from the windows was effectively nothing, a uniform gray, white, moving constantly, the sound of it against the house, a continuous pressure, like something trying to find the seams. The lamp in the kitchen was the primary light source, and it threw everyone into a close, warm circle that had the quality of a space defined by the weather outside rather than by choice. It was the first time all of them had been confined to the same space for an extended period, and Gideon waited for it to be difficult. People crowded by circumstances either found each other or wore each other down. He'd seen both. What happened was neither dramatic nor simple, which was the honest way of most things. Miles had the harness piece on the table and was now at a stage of the repair that required him to consult Gideon, because the buckle mechanism had a particular order of assembly that wasn't obvious from looking at it, and he'd reached the point where guessing would mean undoing work he'd already done. He brought it to Gideon without making a production of asking for help, which was a thing Miles was getting better at. The boy had a specific pride about his work that was understandable, but sometimes made asking feel like defeat. Gideon showed him the sequence twice, slowly, and the second time Miles did it alongside him with his own hands. There, Miles said, when the buckle seated correctly. Finish the stitchings on the loop, Gideon said. That's the part that'll fail first if you leave it. Miles went back to the table. Caleb had descended from the stairs at some point during this and was now sitting at the table's other end with a piece of paper, doing something with a pencil that was either drawing or writing. It was hard to tell from across the room, and Gideon didn't ask. Noah had migrated from his chair to the floor near the stove, where he'd built a small, elaborate arrangement of matchboxes and wooden spools into something that appeared to be a settlement of some kind, population of which he was managing with the focused seriousness of a city planner. Ethan was in the chair nearest the window, looking at the nothing visible through it, turning something over in his mind. He'd been doing this for an hour. Clara brought coffee to the table and sat down across from where Gideon was sitting, and for a while they just existed in the same room with the others, not talking, while the storm made its arguments against the walls and the fire made its counter-arguments in the stove. It was, Gideon thought, and he thought it carefully, not wanting to overdraw it, not unlike what he'd imagined a house could be when he was younger. Before the years had persuaded him that the imagining was the part that had been wrong. He didn't say this. He drank his coffee. Ethan, Clara said. The boy turned from the window. Tell me what you saw on the fence line. It was not, Gideon recognized, a question about the fence. It was an invitation, extended in the form of a practical question, because Ethan was the kind of person who responded to practical questions. The answer would be practical. But the action was something else. Ethan turned more fully toward the room. He described what he'd found: the post, the tension change in the adjacent wire, the angle of the break, suggesting the freeze-thaw cycle had been working at the base of it for several weeks, not just the current storm. He was precise about it. Clear. He used the vocabulary of a boy who had been listening carefully to a man who knew the land, and the listening had become knowledge. When he finished, Gideon said, "The break on the third post east is going to go the same way. We'll need to reset it before the next melt cycle." "I noticed that one," Ethan said. "It was the same angle." "We'll do it together," Gideon said. "When it's clear," Ethan nodded. And then, because it was the kind of thing you could apparently say in a room made close by a storm in a way you perhaps couldn't say in the open air of ordinary days, "I'm sorry I went out without telling you." Gideon looked at him. "The post needed doing," Ethan continued, "but I should have said where I was going first." That was. He paused, working at the right word with the difficulty of a young man who hadn't had much practice apologizing. "That wasn't right." "No," Gideon agreed. "It wasn't. I'm used to making calls on my own." "I know you are," Gideon said. "But you're not on your own anymore. That changes the call." The room was quiet for a moment, with those words in it. Caleb had stopped writing or drawing on his paper. Noah's settlement had apparently reached a moment of significant civic event that required pausing. Miles's hands on the harness had stilled. Ethan looked at Gideon across the kitchen with a particular expression of someone receiving information they'd been moving toward without knowing they were moving toward it. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Gideon said. Clara was looking at her coffee cup. She was not looking at either of them, but her entire posture had the quality of someone listening to music they hadn't expected to hear. The storm broke in the early hours of Sunday morning. Gideon heard it go, heard the change in the wind's quality, the moment it lost the argument it had been making for 12 hours and started moving through rather than pushing against. He was awake anyway. He lay in the dark and listened to it, and then after a while he got up and went to the kitchen and started the fire. He was sitting with coffee in the quiet of a house that was finally just a house again when Clara came downstairs. She was not surprised to find him there. She got coffee and sat across from him, and they sat in the early morning silence that had its own texture, now not empty, not full, just the specific silence of two people who had spent enough time in the same space to be comfortable in each other's quiet. "I'm going to write to the agency today," she said. Gideon looked at his cup. "I've been thinking about what to say," she continued. "I don't want to leave it longer." "What are you going to tell them?" She turned her cup in her hands. "That the placement is resolved." that both parties are satisfied with the current arrangement. The Laramie option is not required. She paused. That's the language they understand. Placement resolved. Arrangement in place. That's not entirely accurate, Gideon said. The arrangement isn't. He stopped. Isn't what? Clara asked. He looked at her across the table in the gray light of early morning, and he thought about what he was trying to say and whether he knew how to say it without making it into something it wasn't ready to be yet. It isn't what they think an arrangement is, he said carefully. They're going to think it means the other thing. The marital arrangement they thought they'd set up in the first place. I know, Clara said, and you're all right with that. She looked at him levelly. I'm not correcting their assumption, she said. Whatever the arrangement actually is, it's ours to define, not theirs. He sat with that. That seems like it leaves a lot undefined, he said. Yes, Clara agreed. It does. She held his gaze without apology. I'm not asking you to define it today. I'm asking if you're willing to leave it undefined for now, with the understanding that it gets worked out as it goes. It was, he recognized, an extraordinarily reasonable thing to say, and the reasonableness of it was somehow more unsettling than an unreasonable demand would have been. Unreasonable demands he knew how to respond to. This required something different. I'm willing, he said. She nodded once. Then I'll write the letter this morning. She wrote it at the kitchen table after breakfast, with the boys occupied variously around the house. Ethan and Gideon had gone out to check the storm damage. Miles was at his bench. Caleb was reading a history book he'd found on Gideon's shelf. Noah was reestablishing contact with the cat, who had emerged from the hay in the barn with the dignified air of an animal that had spent the night in exactly the conditions it had chosen, and was satisfied with its judgment. The letter took her 40 minutes. She wrote it carefully, revised 2 sentences, and read it through once before folding it. She addressed it to Mr. Horace Alderman at the Denver office and put it with the outgoing mail that would go to town when the road was clear. She didn't feel, when she set it down, the relief she'd expected to feel. She felt something quieter and less clean than relief, a kind of settled uncertainty, which was not the same thing as doubt, but was related to it. The decision was made. What came after the decision was still largely open country. She was thinking about this when Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway with the history book. There's a chapter in here about water rights in the territories, he said. She looked up. Is there? In Wyoming, specifically. He held the book open. Gideon has a mark in this chapter. Pencil. In the margin. He carried it to the table and put it in front of her. He underlined something. She looked at the page. The underlining was old years old. Pencil having faded to the gray of age, and it marked a paragraph about the adjudication of creek water rights along property lines and the conditions under which existing agreements could be challenged in territorial court. She looked at it for a moment. Why are you showing me this? She asked. Caleb sat down, because when Mr. Delbert came, he said the fence posts were on our property line. But the water rights would matter more than the fence posts. If someone wanted to make a real argument about the east boundary, Clara looked at her son, 10 years old, with a bruised shoulder that was still yellowing at the edges, reading a territorial land history book for what she could only assume was his own reasons. Delbert hasn't made an argument about water rights, she said. Not yet, Caleb said. But he has 2 ranch hands and a buckboard and small eyes, and he wanted money without a number. That's a certain kind of man. He looked at the book. A certain kind of man usually has more than one thing he's working on at once. Clara sat back and looked at her youngest, but one, who had arrived in this house 6 weeks ago, carrying the weight of months of displacement, and had apparently spent that time reading property law alongside watching footsteps and counting fence posts and doing all the other things that Caleb did, with the quiet relentlessness of a mind that could not help paying attention. I'll mention it to Gideon, she said. I already marked the page, Caleb said. He had. She saw inserted a small slip of paper as a bookmark, which suggested he'd thought about this before coming downstairs. Course you did, she said. He took the book back and went to the front room. and Clara sat at the table and looked at the letter she'd written and thought about Caleb's observation, which was probably nothing, and had the specific quality of possibly being something. And she thought about a man named Frank Delbert with small eyes and a demand without a number. And she thought about Gideon's pencil mark in a chapter about water rights in Wyoming territory. She added a note on a separate piece of paper and set it with the letter, not for the agency, but for Gideon. When he came in at noon with Ethan, both of them carrying the cold of the morning and the information of the storm's toll. 2 fence sections needed full replacement rather than repair. The roof on the small outbuilding had lost 3 shingles, which was manageable. One of the older cattle, a cow Gideon had been watching since November, had gone down in the night. He said this last thing quietly in the way of a man who'd lost animals before and had not become indifferent to it, but had learned that the indulgence of stopping for it was a cost the work couldn't always afford. Ethan said nothing. He'd found the cow, and he'd known what it meant, and he'd helped Gideon deal with what needed dealing with, and he hadn't made Gideon carry it alone, which was something. Clara put lunch on the table, and they ate, and she let the morning work settle before she put the note she'd written in front of Gideon. He read it. His face did something contained and specific. Caleb found the chapter, she said. I see that. He thinks Delbert is working on something more than a feed compensation. Gideon set the note down. He was quiet for a moment in a way that had the quality of a man who had already been thinking about something in a lower register and had now had it raised to audible. The Eastern Creek, he said. The water rights were my grandfather's claim, filed in 1862. I've got the original document in the deed box in the bedroom. When did Delbert buy his land? Clara asked. 1878. He looked at the note. 16 years after the water claim. He knew it when he bought. He's always known. But the fence argument puts him near the property line, Clara said. And if the line moved, the water claim moves with it, Gideon said. They looked at each other across the table. I need to go into Cheyenne, Gideon said. Not just for the outgoing mail. I need to talk to someone at the land office. How soon? Road'll be passable by Tuesday if the temperature stays above 0. Clara nodded. I'll write out everything Caleb found in the chapter. The specific terms. You can take it with you. He's 10 years old, Gideon said, not dismissively with something closer to quiet astonishment. He's 10 years old, Clara agreed. Was reading territorial law for something to do on a Sunday morning. Gideon looked toward the front room where the sounds of the house went about their business. Miles's work. Noah's ongoing conversation with the cat who had apparently followed him indoors. Caleb's silence, which was its own kind of busy. Ethan was at the table still, eating with the steady appetite of someone who'd worked hard through a cold morning. He looked at all of it, and then he looked at Clara, and he said, the deed box is in the top shelf of the bedroom closet. The water claim document is in the green folder inside it. You should know where that is. It was, in its way, the most direct thing he'd said to her yet. The location of the deed box was not information you gave someone who was leaving. It was information you gave someone who was staying, someone who might need to find it when you weren't there. Claire received it with the gravity it deserved. I'll look at it this afternoon, she said. Good, he said, and went back to eating. The trip to Cheyenne on Tuesday took Gideon most of the day. He left before light and was back after dark. And when he came in, Clara could see from his face that the phone from the land office was not simple. The boys had gone to bed. She'd waited up, not performing the wait, but genuinely awake at the kitchen table, with the deed documents she'd spent 2 days organizing into a clear sequence. He sat down and she poured him coffee, and he told her what he'd found. Delbert had filed an inquiry with the land office in October, 3 months before the fence came down, 3 months before the feed compensation demand. The inquiry was a formal question about the original survey of the eastern boundary, citing a possible error in the 1,861 measurements. If the survey was found to be an error, the fence line would move. If the fence line moved, the water claim would become contested. He's been building to this, Clara said, for at least 6 months. Gideon said. Maybe longer. The fence coming down in the storm that was convenient for him gave him a reason to come here, to see what kind of shape I was in. And what kind of shape did he see? Gideon looked at his coffee. A man stretched thin, 60 head down from 90, running lean, no full-time hands. He paused. Someone who might settle quietly to avoid the cost of a legal fight. What did the land office say about the survey? They said the original survey records are in Denver. It could take months to get them reviewed, during which time the inquiry sits as an open question. He set the cup down. The man I spoke to, Henderson, older fellow, been there 20 years, he said, off the record that this kind of inquiry was sometimes filed, not because anyone expected to win, but because the open question created enough uncertainty to make the other party settle. Leverage, Clara said. Leverage, Gideon agreed. She looked at the organized documents in front of her. So the water claim is in your grandfather's name, filed in '62, registered in the territorial record. She turned to the relevant page. But was it ever formally attached to the land deed? Because if it's attached, Gideon said. He looked at the page she was indicating. My father did it in '71. I found the attachment document in the green folder. Then a survey dispute about the fence line doesn't automatically touch the water claim, Clara said. Claim predates the fence line by 9 years and is attached to the deed by registration. A survey error would have to be significant enough to remove land that was already deeded before Delbert's purchase. Gideon was looking at her. I read the chapter Caleb found, she said. And then I read 3 more chapters. And then I read your grandfather's claim document, which is more specific than you may realize. You've been doing this since Sunday, he said. I've been doing this since Sunday, she confirmed. You need a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. But you need to go into this meeting at the land office with the attachment document and the original claim and a clear argument about the timeline. And you need to do it before Delbert's inquiry produces any kind of preliminary finding. Gideon sat back. Outside the kitchen window, the Wyoming night was clear and very cold, the stars doing their indifferent Wyoming business above a land that didn't particularly care what any of them decided. But inside the kitchen, in the circle of the lamp's light, 2 people were sitting at a table with documents spread between them, and the specific energy of people working a problem together, not performing collaboration, but actually doing it, finding where each other's thinking went and adding to it, rather than around it. I'll find a lawyer in Cheyenne, he said. There's a man named Abbott who handled the original deed transfer when I bought out my brother's share in '91. He's competent. How soon can you see him? I'll write tomorrow. You can probably see me within the week. Clara nodded. She began organizing the documents into the order they'd need to present them. I'll write out the timeline. Survey date, deed date, water claim date, attachment date, Delbert's purchase date. A lawyer can argue from a timeline. Clara. She looked up. He was looking at her across the documents and the lamp and the organized evidence of 2 solid days of work she'd done on behalf of a ranch that was not technically hers for a legal situation that was not technically her problem, using knowledge she'd assembled because a 10-year-old boy had put a book in front of her on a snowy Sunday morning. Thank you, he said. It was not a small thing from Gideon Voss. She understood that. This land is what keeps the ranch running, she said. The water especially. She held his gaze. I have 4 children who are sleeping well for the first time in a year and a half. That matters more to me than whether the arrangement has a tidy name. He held her gaze for a long moment. It's a good ranch, he said. I want you to know that. It's been a hard few years, but it's good land, and it runs right when it's tended right. I know, she said. I've been reading the ledgers. He almost smiled again. This time, it made it further than before, not quite complete but closer, a real movement, something that would have been recognizable as a smile to someone watching. We should sleep, she said, and began organizing the documents into a stack. In the morning, he said, I want to check the east fence before the thaw starts. If you're right about Delbert building a case, I want to make sure every post on that line is exactly where it's supposed to be and documented as such. Ethan knows where the weak posts are, Clarissa said. I know he does, Gideon said. She looked at him as she stood the organized stack of documents in her hands. He's going to be good at this, she said. This land. Whatever happens with the legal situation, whatever happens with all of it, he's going to understand it the way you understand it. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He already does, he said. He understood the fence tension before I showed him why it mattered. He's 16, Clara said. He has time to learn the rest. He does, Gideon said. She took the documents to the front shelf and set them in the spot they needed to be for the morning. Gideon sat at the table a little longer, with the cold coming off his coat and the coffee going cold and the house quiet around him, in the way it was quiet. Now not empty quiet, not the hollow quiet of a space that had been evacuated of everything warm and alive, but the full quiet of a house where people were sleeping and the day's work had been done as well as it could be done, and the morning would bring more of it. He thought about Delbert and the inquiry and the land office and the lawyer he would write to tomorrow. Thought about these things with the focused, practical attention they required. And underneath that, below the level where he was going to examine tonight, he thought about a woman who had spent 2 days reading territorial land law for a home she hadn't chosen, and a problem that wasn't technically hers. And he thought about a boy who had marked the page and brought the book downstairs. And he thought about the east fence line, where a post had been reset in a blizzard by a 16-year-old who'd gone out because it needed doing, and he didn't need to be told. He sat with all of that. Then he got up, and he banked the fire properly, and he went to bed. The letter to lawyer Abbott went out on Wednesday, and his reply came back by Friday, which told Gideon something about the man's assessment of the situation's urgency. Abbott had read the summary, Clara had written the timeline, the dates, the attachment document, and his reply was 3 pages of close, practical handwriting that said, in essence, come to my office Monday, bring everything, and do not speak to Delbert or anyone at the land office before then. Gideon brought everything. Clara had organized it into a leather satchel that had belonged to her husband, the only thing of his she'd kept that had a practical use, and she'd put the documents in the order a lawyer would want them, not the order they'd been found in. Gideon noticed this when he picked it up Monday morning and felt the difference between a bag full of papers and a bag full of an argument. He rode to Cheyenne in weather that had turned towards something that almost resembled the idea of spring without fully committing to it. The temperature above zero, the sky a pale washed-out blue, the ground still hard but not hostile. He left Ethan in charge of the morning work, which he'd done without ceremony, and Ethan had received the responsibility without ceremony either, which was how those exchanges worked best between them now. Abbott's office was on the 2nd floor of a building on Ferguson Street, above a surveyor's office, which Gideon considered either ironic or appropriate given the circumstances. The lawyer himself was 60, lean in the way of men who'd always been lean and would be until they weren't anymore, with a precise gray mustache and the habit of reading documents with his entire body still except for his eyes. Moved through text with the focused speed of a man who'd spent 4 decades distilling what mattered from what didn't. He read for 20 minutes without speaking. Gideon sat across the desk and waited, which he was capable of doing without filling the silence. The attachment document is the key, Abbott said finally. Your father filed this in 71 with the territorial registrar. The water claim is not separable from the deed. A survey adjustment to the fence line, even a legitimate one, cannot reach back 9 years to invalidate a registered water claim. He set the paper down. Delbert's inquiry is a pressure tactic. He likely knew this before he filed it. Can he keep the inquiry open? He can try. But I can file a counterstatement to the land office this week with this documentation, and Henderson, you said Henderson? Henderson will know what it means. The inquiry will go quiet. He paused. Delbert may try something else. Men like this usually have patience. What else might he try? Abbott looked at him. Has he ever suggested buying the eastern portion of your land? Gideon was still for a moment, not directly. 4 years ago, he mentioned in passing that if I ever wanted to reduce my acreage, the eastern parcel would be convenient for him. He'll come back to that, Abbott said. Probably within the year. When this inquiry goes nowhere, he'll recalculate and try a different approach. He put the documents back in order. My advice is to document the eastern fence line, formally hire a surveyor of your own, independent, and get your line confirmed on paper. Cost, but it closes the argument permanently. How much is a surveyor? Abbott named a figure. It was manageable, not comfortable, but manageable within the range of what Clara's reorganized account plan had freed up by April, assuming the spring went reasonably. I'll do it, Gideon said. He rode home with the empty satchels and a counterstatement from Abbott, already drafted, and when he walked into the kitchen that evening and told Clara what the lawyer had said, she listened to all of it and then said, Caleb will want to know about the attachment document. Gideon looked at her. He's 10. I know how old he is, Clara said. Tell him anyway. He found it. So after supper, Gideon sat at the table with Caleb and explained, in plain language, what the attachment document meant and why it mattered, and how the legal argument rested on it. Caleb listened with his chin in his hand and his eyes on Gideon's face and asked 2 questions, both of them precise, both of them, about things Gideon had to think about before he could answer cleanly. When he was done, Caleb nodded once. Delbert won't stop, Caleb said. He's the kind of man who doesn't stop. He'll just find a different door. I know, Gideon said. We'll be ready for the different door. Caleb seemed satisfied with this. He slid down from his chair and went upstairs, and Gideon sat alone at the table for a moment, thinking about what it meant that the clearest strategic assessment of Frank Delbert had come from a 10-year-old boy who read territorial law on Sunday mornings for entertainment. Spring came to Wyoming the way it always did, grudgingly, incompletely, with several false starts, and at least one return of real cold that made you question whether it had meant any of its earlier promises. Came. The east fence line was resurveyed by a man named Pruitt in the 3rd week of March, an independent contractor out of Laramie, who arrived with his equipment and his assistant and spent 2 days walking the boundary with the thoroughness of someone who understood that his work was going to be argued about. His findings confirmed what Gideon's grandfather had staked in 1861. The fence line was correct. Posts were where they belonged. There was no survey error. The land office received Abbott's counterstatement, along with Pruitt's independent survey results in the 1st week of April. Henderson wrote back in his careful official hand to say the inquiry had been reviewed and found insufficient to proceed. The file was closed. Gideon read this letter at the kitchen table, with Clara across from him, and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he folded it and put it in the green folder with the other documents, and handed the folder to Clara. Put it with the deed box, he said. She took it without comment and went to do exactly that. And when she came back, she poured coffee for both of them, and they drank it in the morning light that was, for the first time in months, genuinely warm through the kitchen window. Frank Delbert did not come to the ranch again that spring. Whether this was tactical patience or simple acknowledgement that the approach had failed, Gideon couldn't say. Caleb's prediction was probably right. A man like Delbert didn't stop, he redirected. But the water was secured, the line was documented, and when the different door appeared, as it eventually would, they would be standing on the right side of it, with paperwork. The north pasture got turned in the 2nd week of April. It was 6 days of work, which was more than Gideon had budgeted in either time or labor, and it went over because the 3rd day revealed a section of compacted subsoil that required breaking up by hand before the plow could do anything useful with it, and breaking compacted subsoil by hand was exactly as laborious as it sounded. Ethan worked it alongside Gideon for all 6 days. Not as a child helping an adult, not as an apprentice supervised by a tradesman, as a second worker on a job that required someone who understood what the work was trying to accomplish, and contributed to it with his own judgment, who made calls when Gideon's back was turned and made them correctly, who at the end of a 12-hour day was as tired as Gideon and showed it without embarrassment. On the 4th evening, sitting on the porch steps with the light going out over the flat land. Gideon said, "You know what you're doing out there." Ethan was looking at his hands, which had the new roughness that fieldwork built over time. "I'm learning what I'm doing," he said. "There's a difference." "Less than you think," Gideon said. Ethan looked at him. "A man who knows he's still learning is a better worker than a man who thinks he's finished," Gideon says. "I've known that since I was your age, and I still have to remind myself." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Then my father wasn't a farmer. He was a clerk. Good at figures, good with paper." He said this without criticism, just description. "I didn't learn land work from him." "No," Gideon said. "You figured it out. Some of it. Most of it," Gideon said. "The rest comes with seasons. You can't learn some things except by doing them enough times." The light finished going out, and the first stars came up over the eastern plain, and they sat on the steps a while, longer without talking, the way people sat who had worked beside each other all day, and didn't need to reconstruct the connection at the end of it, because the connection was already there. It was Miles who asked the question directly. This was in May, a warm evening with the kitchen windows open. For the first time since October, when the house smelled like the turned pasture, and the kitchen garden Clara had started along the south wall, and the particular smell of a ranch in spring that was compounded of a dozen things, and was, when you lived it long enough, just the smell of home. Miles came in from the tool shed, where he'd spent the afternoon with a project he'd taken on, independently repairing the cultivator seat mechanism properly, replacing the parts Gideon's temporary fix had been substituting for. He washed his hands at the basin and sat at the table and looked at Gideon with the directness he'd always had, the quality of a boy who saw no particular advantage in going around the thing he meant to say. "Are we staying?" he said. Gideon was at the bench by the window. Clara was at the stove. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I mean permanently," Miles said, "not through the season." "Permanently." Gideon looked at Clara. Clara turned from the stove and looked at Miles with the expression she wore when she was deciding not to manage something. Then she looked at Gideon. "Yes," Gideon said. Miles took this in. He nodded once, in the decisive way he had, that suggested he'd received the information and was now integrating it into his existing model of the situation. "Okay," he said, "because I've been thinking about the water pump on the west side. It's losing pressure. I think the intake valve is worn. I can fix it, if you have a replacement valve. There's one on the second shelf in the tool shed," Gideon said. "The new-looking one in the brown paper." "Okay," Miles said, and got up and went back outside. Clara stood at the stove for a moment after he left, her back to Gideon, and then she turned and looked at him across the kitchen with an expression that was complicated and human and not performing anything. "Was that a decision?" she said. "Yes," he said, "I think it was." "You didn't ask me, I know." He held her gaze. "I should have, but I didn't, because I already knew what you'd say, and I knew that if I waited until it felt like the right moment to say it properly, it might not get said until we were both too stubborn to admit it needed saying." Stood with that. "That's probably true," she said. "I'd like to make it formal," he said. "The arrangement, if you're willing. In the way the agency thought they were arranging it in the first place, except with both of us having decided it ourselves." The kitchen was quiet except for whatever was happening on the stove. "That's not a romantic proposal," Clara said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not certain I know how to do a romantic proposal at this point. I know how to tell you that this ranch runs better with you in it than it did without you. I know that your children have become people I think about. I know that when I walk into a room you're in, the room makes more sense than it did 5 minutes before." He paused. "I don't know how to say that in a way that sounds like the right kind of thing to say." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "It sounds exactly like the right kind of thing," she said. "It just doesn't sound like what people think the right kind of thing is supposed to sound like. Is that all right?" She crossed the kitchen and picked up his coffee cup and refilled it from the pot and set it back in front of him, and stood there for a moment close enough that the quiet between them had a different quality than it usually had. "Yes," she said. That's all right. She went back to the stove and Gideon sat with his coffee and the decision that had been made, not with ceremony but with the kind of straightforward human truth that fit the two of them better than ceremony would have. They married in June. It was a small thing, at the county courthouse in Cheyenne, with Abbott as a witness and a clerk, who performed the civil ceremony with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd performed it many times and respected it no less for the repetition. The boys wore their good clothes, which in Noah's case included a collar that he submitted to with the martyred patience of a 5-year-old who understood that some discomforts were non-negotiable. After they ate at a restaurant on Cary Avenue, the whole family at one table, which drew 1 or 2 glances from other diners, a woman and a weathered rancher, and 4 boys covering a range of ages, the configuration not immediately legible to strangers. Gideon noticed the glances and felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific comfort of not caring about them. Ethan ordered coffee like an adult and drank it without making a face, which was a performance but a committed one. Miles asked the waiter a question about how the kitchen managed its supply ordering, which led to a 3-minute conversation that the waiter appeared to enjoy. Caleb sat with his water glass and listened to every conversation at the surrounding tables simultaneously, which was just what Caleb did in rooms full of people. Noah ate his meal with the concentrated seriousness of a child who has decided that a restaurant is a significant occasion and must be treated as such. Clara sat beside Gideon and ate her food, and at one point, when Noah knocked his fork off the table and it landed with a clatter, and the surrounding tables turned to look, she and Gideon looked at each other at the same moment with the same expression, which was the expression of 2 people who had chosen a life that was genuinely theirs, imperfect and practical and fully occupied. The summer turned the ranch into something that worked. Not in the way of a story that resolves cleanly and wraps itself in evidence of its own rightness. It didn't work like that. Worked in the way actual ranches worked, inconsistently, with setbacks and recoveries, and days when everything cooperated, and days when nothing did. And the difference between a good season and a bad one was often a matter of a few degrees of temperature in the wrong week, or a decision made in November that looked different in July. But it worked. The North pasture came up with better grass than Gideon had seen from it. In 4 years, the turned soil having done what Clara's account plan had said it would do. The herd held steady and then grew, not dramatically, not enough to put them back to 90, but enough to change the color of the ledger from the red-tinged anxiety of February to something that approached the black with genuine intent. Clara's kitchen garden became, by August, more than a kitchen garden. It was a systematic operation. It was a systematic operation organized with the same logic she'd applied to the pantry, producing enough surplus that she'd made arrangements with the general store in town to take some of it on consignment. The amount was not large, but it was money from a source that hadn't existed in February, and in a tight operation, that kind of money was not small. Gideon told her the consignment idea was good. She said she'd been thinking about expanding it the following year, adding 2 more rows along the south wall and a cold storage setup that Miles had already drawn preliminary plans for. Miles's plans were characteristically detailed and practical, and accounted for the slope of the drainage in a way that an adult engineer might not have thought to address. "He's 12, Gideon said, looking at the plans. "He was 12 in January," Clara said. "He'll be 13 in September." Still, she agreed, with the specific satisfaction of a mother watching a child discover what they were actually made of. Caleb's shoulder had healed completely by March, leaving no trace of the fall except a small story, and, apparently, a revised assessment of what he was capable of. He did not get on any more roofs without asking. He did get on 2 more roofs, with permission, the tool shed in April, and the barn's lower section in May, both times with Gideon below, and the specific understanding that asking was not weakness, that knowing when you needed someone to be there was a form of competence rather than a failure of it. This seemed to reorder something in Caleb's internal architecture. Couldn't have named it, must and nobody tried to name it for him. But it was visible in the slight unwinding of the constant vigilance he carried, the way he sometimes sat in a room and just sat, without scanning it, without cataloging, without preparing for the next thing that might need managing. He still heard footsteps at 2 in the morning. But the footsteps he was tracking were now Gideon's habitual late-night check of the stove, and the pattern was familiar, and familiar things were not things that needed to be worried about. In September, 3 weeks after Miles turned 13, Delbert sent a letter, not to the land office, to Gideon directly. A formal typewritten letter he'd apparently paid someone to type it, offering to purchase the eastern 40 acres of the Voss property at a price that was technically fair but strategically pointed. Gideon read it and passed it to Clara. She read it and passed it to Caleb, who read it in 30 seconds. He found the different door, Caleb said. He did, Gideon said. Are you going to sell? No, then write back and say no. Don't explain why. Don't offer a different arrangement. Just no. He handed the letter back. If you explain, he'll negotiate against the explanation. If you just say no, there's nothing to work with. Gideon looked at him across the table. I know, he said. That was already my plan. Good, Caleb said. He went back to whatever he'd been reading. Gideon wrote back the following morning. 1 paragraph. The eastern 40 acres were not for sale. He appreciated the offer. He wished Delbert well. The letter was 4 sentences and contained nothing that could be negotiated against. He didn't hear from Delbert again that year. Ethan turned 17 in October. The day passed without the kind of event that marked it as remarkable, because Ethan was not a person who organized his life around events that marked things as remarkable. He worked in the morning and helped repair a section of the barn floor in the afternoon, and came in for supper to find that Clara had made the molasses cake he'd mentioned offhandedly in August that his mother used to make, told him how long she'd been thinking about it, and he sat at the table and ate it with a face that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing. After supper, Gideon went out to the porch, and Ethan followed him, and they stood in the October dark with the cold coming back in the way it came back in Wyoming, and the stars doing their indifferent work overhead. I've been thinking, Ethan said. About what? Spring. After spring. What comes after? He was looking at the dark outline of the north pasture where the better grass had been and would be again. I'd like to learn the business side. Not just the land work, the numbers, the buying and selling. What makes a year good or bad on paper? Your mother can teach you that, Gideon said. She knows it better than I do. I know, Ethan said. I've been watching her do the ledger. I've been trying to understand the logic of it. He paused. I'd like to understand all of it. The land and the numbers. Both. Gideon stood with that for a moment. A boy who was almost a man, standing on a porch in Wyoming, telling you what he wanted to understand. Not what he needed. Not what circumstances required. What he wanted as a person with a future that he was choosing to think about instead of just surviving through. We'll start this winter, Gideon said. When the field work is down, I'll sit with you and the ledger and we'll go through a full year's cycle. What drives the numbers and why? Ethan nodded. You know, Gideon said, not looking at the boy, looking at the dark. Your father would have been proud of you. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Maybe, he said. He was proud of different things than you would be. He was a different kind of man. That's true of most fathers and sons, Gideon said. Another silence. I know you're not my father, Ethan said. I'm not saying that. I know you're not saying that, Gideon said. I'm saying that's what you've. He stopped. Started again with the particular difficulty of a 17-year-old boy, trying to say a true thing without making it into something he couldn't carry. What you've done with all of us. It wasn't required. You could have sent us back in January, and nobody could have said you were wrong. I know that, Gideon said. Why didn't you? Gideon thought about it. The real answer, not the manageable one. Because when I looked at you all standing on that platform in the cold, he said, I saw what it cost your mother not to ask for help. And I thought a person who works that hard not to need anyone probably needs someone more than most. He paused, and I was right. Ethan looked at the dark. She did need someone, he said. We all did, so did I, Gideon said. I just didn't know what to call it. Porch held them both in the cold October dark, and after a while they went back inside to where the lamp was lit and the fire was going and the house was doing. The thing it did now, holding its people in the specific warmth of a place that has been fully occupied, that has had life pressed into its walls and floors until the walls and floors have accepted the presence and the presence has accepted them back. There are things you plan for and things that find you, and the difference between a life that works and one that doesn't is often less about which category more things fall into and more about what you do with the ones that find you. Gideon Voss had planned for a housekeeper. He had not planned for a family. He had not planned for a boy who fixed fence in blizzards, or a boy who read land law, or a boy who made cold storage plans at 12, or a small child who made his peace with the dark through a barn cat and warm milk and the simple consistency of someone being there when he woke up frightened. He had not planned for a woman who reorganized his pantry and read his ledger and sat across the kitchen table at midnight, working out the argument that saved his water rights and then said good night and meant it as a full sentence, not a question. Clara had not planned for this either. She had planned for survival for a landing place after the wreckage of what had come before, somewhere she could put her children down long enough for them to figure out who they were. She had not planned to find a place that asked her to be fully herself in return, that valued exactly the things she'd been told were inconvenient: her directness, her competence, her refusal to make herself smaller as a courtesy. This is what people's rarely say about the families they didn't expect, that they're harder than the ones you planned, that there's no script, no established understanding about what each person owes the others, no comfort of long familiarity to smooth over the rough days. You build it from scratch, and the building shows in the finished thing, all the visible joints and adjusted angles, the places where two different materials had to learn to hold each other's weight. But here is also what people rarely say, that the families you didn't expect are sometimes the ones that fit, not because they're perfect, because they're true, because you chose them with full knowledge of what you were choosing, not with the blindness of inevitability, not because there was no other option, but because you looked at what was in front of you and said yes. That yes was the hardest thing Gideon Voss had ever done. Harder than 4 years alone, harder than 2 bad winters, and a failing ledger, and a land dispute built by a patient, small-eyed neighbor. The hardest thing he'd done was stand in his own kitchen on an ordinary night and admit to himself that he wanted people in it. Clara's yes had been harder still, because she'd already lost the thing you were supposed to be able to count on, and she'd been asked to count on something again anyway. That took a different kind of courage than the kind she was known for. Practical courage, the competence, the forward motion, the refusal to be managed, that was the courage she'd built from necessity. The other kind, the one that let her sit across a table from a man with a folded piece of paper and say the arrangement is ours to define, the one that let her write to an agency and close a door to a safer-seeming option, that was the kind you couldn't build from necessity alone. That was the kind you had to decide to have. The Voss ranch ran through its second winter with 2 full hands, a properly kept ledger, 600 feet of documented fence, and a water claim that would not be moved by pressure or paperwork, or the patient patience of men with small eyes and buckboards. The herd came through it in better shape than the 2 winters before it. The north pasture was ready for the spring. The tool shed had a new roof, properly done, with Caleb on the ground handing materials and Miles on the boards, and Gideon on the ladder doing the difficult sections, and Ethan managing the supply line between all 3. Noah, 6 years old, and fully in possession of the winter, watched the whole operation from the fence post he'd been assigned to sit on, wrapped in a coat 2 sizes large that had been Caleb's, narrating the proceedings to the barn cat, who had joined him on the post with the resigned dignity of an animal that had accepted a lifetime of being talked to. That was how it looked from the outside. A ranch in Wyoming in winter, people working, a small boy on a fence post, a cat. From the inside, it looked like what it was, a life chosen, piece by piece, by people who had every reason not to and did anyway. It is not a small thing. It never is.